Hey y'all, I'm back with a brief talk on the story, what we talk about when we talk about love. Although there's plenty of menace to go around in this story, I'm hoping that we can focus on a different aspect in this story as it has kind of course-wide relevance. We've talked about it quite a lot throughout the semester and it's going to keep coming up, and that is just a real central focus on character. In previous in-person classes, we discussed fairly thoroughly this idea of character. I've had you journal on it. I've had you think about your own character in terms of these fictional characters, different character traits, motivations, and in particular, the nature of change, like how characters change, both ourselves and again in fiction. Consider the characters in Cathedral, right? We see a pretty monumental change in a character in Cathedral who's pretty prejudiced, bigot, kind of just a jerk, and becomes, much different by the end of the story. And then we have Morrison's Recitatif, where we have two characters with very similar beginnings who undergo big changes in different directions, right? And then we looked at Letham's Super Goatman, and we talked about, this superhero who underwent these crazy changes in his life. So we've thought about how change happens over time and what makes these characters change as individuals. Now, there's been a lot to say about character over the years, and it wasn't always thought that characters change. Even now, people often speak of character as if there's like some kind of essence, some permanent self or soul or spirit that kind of drives our being. And our fictional characters often come from that place as well. Aristotle, coming to us from the 4th century BC, says that character is second in importance to plot when it comes to stories, right? So what people do is more important than some kind of essence that they have. Specifically, Aristotle says, quote, character reflects moral purpose, showing what kinds of things a man chooses or avoids. So in other words, character is just an expression of moral purpose. This is a rather flat notion of character. A person is faced with experiences and they choose or avoid certain things, and that shows us who they are. In other words, who they are is always the same. The idea of change was probably best illustrated by E.M. Forrester in his book Aspects of the Novel. This is the idea that you were probably taught in high school or at some other point, where he coins the terms flat and round characters and argues basically that there are these two types in fiction, and there's those that surprise us by changing and those who don't. They just serve a kind of plot-based purpose. A much more dynamic depiction than Aristotle's, who seemed to think that humans just had this essence and didn't change that much. Now, more contemporarily, like right now, in the late 20th century really, writers such as Roland Barthes suggested something perhaps more elemental to fiction. I don't know. Characters in literature, he says, are simply combinations of textual elements, something he called semes, S-E-M-E-S. They don't stay the same or change. They're just the sum total of a combination of words on a page. They're what he called, quote, a product of combinations, which I suppose is true and worth thinking about if we can get our heads around that idea. Now, I don't mean to complicate things here, but I want you to have a sense of the many ways that we can think and talk about character and change and literature. And so let's discuss the gin-soaked conversation that is at the center of what we talk about when we talk about love. A key question I'll ask us to think about is this. Although this happens over the course of a single afternoon, what changes do these characters undergo, if any? Which are the round characters here? We have the narrator, and then there's Mel, Terry, and Laura, and of course Terry's ex, Ed, who is only present in the story Terry tells about him. Now, as a side note, if you haven't heard of Platos Symposium, it is ever present in this story. In the Symposium, written obviously by Plato, a group of Greeks get together and basically have a love praising contest. That is, who can praise the god of love most adequately? And this story is kind of a take on that, right? They do toast to love at one point. They have a toast. However, This is obviously very different. I'll spoil the symposium for you. Socrates wins. It's worth a read, especially if you've never read Plato before. And there's some really like odd, strange depictions of love. Like there's one point where one of the characters basically explains that people were combined together in some other realm, and then they were split apart, and our role on Earth is to find that other half of us. You know, it's a pretty wild thing. So anyway, we get a bunch of depictions of love, none of which is final in what we talk about when we talk about love. Our narrator tells us that, quote, Mel thought real love was nothing less than spiritual love, unquote. But then that is based on action. Mel wants to come back in another life as a knight. This is a clue. Knights did heroic deeds simply to prove their love. They're more Aristotelian than any other view that we see in the story, right? Love is not measured by your essence or who you are, but by the brave acts that you did. This was the medieval courtship in the knightly tradition. You're a knight. You get stricken by love. You see someone, you fall in love immediately. This is how it went. So you go out, you guard a bridge or something, or kill some enemies that the maiden wants killed, and then you get your prize. That's how love works in medieval literature, you know, in general. So Mel's thinking this way, but he's also got this thing. He's a heart surgeon, right? He works on the most important symbol of love. But he says he fixes it like it's a car that needs a new transmission. He calls himself a mechanic. Mel also tells this story about the old people in the car accident. Think of Cathedral when considering this one, right? The husband is depressed because he can't physically see his wife. I'll leave it to you to consider that. And Mel also says this, quote, there was a time when I thought I loved my first wife more than life itself, but now I hate her guts. I do. How do you explain that? What happened to that love? What happened to it is what I'd like to know, unquote. And then Mel also weirdly comes on to Laura in a line or two toward the end of the story. Is this Mel changing? Is it just him getting drunk? At first he says distinctively when Terry tells this story about Ed, quote, he dragged me around the room by my ankles, unquote, and you recall the story at the beginning, that it could not be love, he says. But later, as he gets drunker, he says that we should be ashamed for pretending to know anything about it. But this is crucial. He says when we talk about it. So maybe love is something that's felt and not spoken about. I don't know. And meanwhile, the narrator is kind of like a robot. And what we hear from him, he says, quote, in addition to being in love, he's talking about himself and Laura here, we like each other and enjoy each other's company. She's easy to be with, unquote. That's on page 141. Not the kind of love Terry's talking about with Ed, that's for sure. But just as physical, see how Laura and the narrator convey their love? Almost entirely through touch. He grabs her wrist and holds it at one point. He touches her thigh. Touch is what they use to convey their love. Now, all of these characters change in that they get drunk. But do they change otherwise? Do their views on love change? How? And therein we get some of the central questions of Carver's entire book. Does love change us? If there's such a thing as an essence, is that essence altered by these experiences with others? If so, in what ways? I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the discussion forum, and I hope you all are, holding steady out there. And I applaud you in the work that you're doing now, and I encourage you to stick to it. Until next time, I'll see you.